My daughter-in-law told me to leave my own home on the day I buried my son. She said it in the church parking lot at St. Helena's Episcopal in Beaufort, South Carolina, 15 minutes after they lowered Jerome's casket into the ground, while I was still holding the funeral program with his senior photo on the cover, the photo where he's wearing his Beaufort High coaching polo and smiling the smile he got from his daddy, wide and unguarded, the smile of a man who trusted the world because the world had always been kind to him, which is the most dangerous thing a smile can be, because the world isn't kind to everyone, and the people who trust it completely are the people who get blindsided by the ones who don't. Pearl, I know this is hard, but we need to talk about the house. Jerome and I were married. The house passes to me as his surviving spouse. I think it's best if you find somewhere else to live. I'll give you 30 days. She said 30 days, the way landlords say 30 days, with legal distance, with the tone of a person serving notice, not offering condolence. My son's body was still warm in the ground, the dirt hadn't settled, the flowers on his casket were still upright, and his wife was standing in a parking lot in a black dress that cost more than my groceries for a month, telling me to vacate a house that my great-grandfather built with money that took 3 generations of formerly enslaved people to save. I looked at Vanessa. I looked at her the way I've looked at 1,000 people across a mediation table in 30 years of family court, measuring the distance between what they're saying and what they know, calculating the gap between their confidence and the law, assessing whether they understand they're wrong or genuinely believe they're right. Vanessa believed she was right. She believed the house on Craven Street, the house my great-grandfather Augustus Fontaine bought in 1920, the house that has held 5 generations of Fontaines through Jim Crow and desegregation and hurricanes, and 100 years of a world that tried to take it and couldn't, was now hers because my son was dead, and she was his widow, and widows inherit. She was wrong. She was catastrophically, legally, generationally wrong. And I had known she would be wrong on this exact day, in this exact way, with this exact sentence, for 6 years. Because I'm a retired family court mediator and I've spent 30 years watching people reach for property that doesn't belong to them. I know what reaching looks like. I can see it in the way a person's eyes move across a room, not with love, but with appraisal, not with belonging, but with calculation. Vanessa's eyes have been calculating since 2018, and I've been watching them calculate, and I've been preparing for the day the calculation would become a demand. That day was today. And I was ready. I smiled. Not the smile of a woman who's been defeated. Not the smile of a mother too tired to fight. The smile of a woman who has had the answer prepared since 2015 and has been waiting, patiently, strategically, with the specific discipline of a person who knows that the strongest move in any dispute is not the first one, but the last one. Okay, Vanessa, 30 days. I went home. I walked through the house one more time. I touched the walls that my family has touched for 100 years. I stood in the kitchen where Jerome was born because my labor progressed too fast for the hospital, and the midwife arrived 12 minutes after he did. And the first thing he saw in this world was the ceiling of a house that his ancestors built. I stood on the porch where Clarence proposed in 1980 with a ring that cost $200 and a speech that cost nothing because the best things Clarence ever said were free. I packed one bag. I called my friend Opal. I drove to her house. And the next morning at 8:15 a.m., I walked into the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office with a folder that I'd been holding for 2 years. A folder that contained not just the proof that Vanessa couldn't have my house, but the evidence that she'd committed a federal crime trying to steal from it while my son was still alive. By 9:30 a.m., the police were at her door. But before you understand what was in that folder and why I'd been carrying it for 2 years, and how a retired family court mediator dismantled her daughter-in-law's entire life in 24 hours without raising her voice or shedding a public tear, you need to understand the house. Because the house on Craven Street isn't real estate. It's a document. 100-year-old document written in tabby and tin and live oak roots, and the labor of people who were told they couldn't own anything and owned it anyway. And Vanessa Caldwell's name was never on it. Not on the deed, not on the trust, not on a single piece of paper in 100 years of Fontaine history. She just didn't know that until the police told her. Before I go further, I need to ask you something. Have you ever watched someone reach for something that belongs to your family? Something that your people built with hands that bled and years that cost and money that took generations to accumulate, and felt the specific fury of knowing they're going to try to take it and the specific calm of knowing they can't? If that question just straightened your spine, stay with me. This story is about a house. But it's really about preparation and the difference between a woman who reaches and a woman who's ready. Subscribe before I continue. Not for me. For every family that built something worth protecting and every mother who made sure the protection was in place before the threat arrived. The house at 14 Craven Street, Beaufort, South Carolina, was purchased in 1920 by Augustus Fontaine, my great-grandfather. Augustus was born in 1868. 3 years after the end of the Civil War, to parents who had been enslaved on a rice plantation in the Low Country. He grew up in the Reconstruction era, which is the era America teaches children about in one paragraph and skips past because the full story is too complicated and too shameful and too revealing about what this country does to people who try to build something after being told for 200 years that they can't. Augustus built something anyway. He worked on the docks. He saved money. He bought a lot on Craven Street for $340, a number I know because the original deed is in the Fontaine family records, handwritten, dated April 1920, signed by a man whose parents couldn't sign their own names. He built the house himself, with help from men in the community. Tabby Foundation, a low-country building material made from oyster shells and lime and sand and water, the material of a coast that uses its own bones to build shelter. Tin roof, wide porch, live oaks in the yard that were already old when Augustus was young and are still standing today, 104 years later, draped in Spanish moss and holding the light the way Beaufort trees hold light, as if the light belongs to them and the sun is just making a delivery. The house passed from Augustus to his son Ezekiel, from Ezekiel to his son Lucian, my father, and from Lucian to me. 4 generations by the time it reached my hands, 5 including Jerome. My father, Lucian, was a school janitor who understood more about property law than most lawyers because he'd spent his life watching black families in the South lose land. Heirs property laws, partition sales, tax liens, predatory developers, family disputes that turned generational wealth into courthouse auctions. Lucian watched it happen to family after family in Beaufort County, and he decided it would not happen to the Fontaines. In 1978, Lucian established the Fontaine Family Irrevocable Trust. I was 21. I didn't fully understand what he was doing at the time. I understand it now. The trust placed the Craven Street property in a legal structure that was designed to survive exactly the kind of person Vanessa Caldwell turned out to be. The terms. The house passes through direct Fontaine bloodline only, parent to child, but only to Fontaine blood descendants. Spouses are explicitly excluded from inheritance or ownership claims. The house cannot be sold, mortgaged, or encumbered without unanimous consent of all living trustees. The trust was Lucian's fortress, built from paper instead of tabby, but just as strong. I grew up in that house. I married Clarence Fontaine in 1980, and he moved in because Fontaine women don't leave Craven Street. Fontaine men move to it. Clarence was a shrimper. He woke at 4 a.m. and came home smelling like salt and diesel and the specific exhaustion of a man who feeds his family by pulling things from the ocean that don't want to be pulled. He proposed on the front porch with a $200 ring and a speech I've replayed 10,000 times since he died. Pearl, I'm not a rich man, but I'll be a present man, every day, right here, on this porch, with you. He was, every day. Until 2009, when his heart stopped on his boat in Port Royal Sound. He was 62. They found him in his captain's chair, facing the water. He died the way he lived, at work, on the ocean, looking at the horizon. I was 52. Jerome was born in 1982 in the back bedroom of the Craven Street house. He was my only child. He became a high school history teacher and assistant football coach at Beaufort High. He taught AP history to kids who didn't know they were smart until Jerome told them they were, and he coached football to kids who didn't know they were strong until Jerome showed them. He was beloved. That's not a word I use because he's dead, and mothers canonize their dead sons. It's a word I use because 350 people came to his funeral, and half of them were former students who drove from 3 states to stand in a church and cry for a man who'd taught them that history isn't about the past, it's about who owns it. Jerome met Vanessa Caldwell at a community fundraiser in Beaufort in 2017. He was 35, she was 31. She was pretty, she was attentive. She asked about his work with a focused interest that feels like love when you're trusting and feels like targeting when you're not. Jerome was trusting. I was not. But I said nothing because mothers who say, "I don't like your girlfriend" before the girlfriend has done anything wrong are mothers who lose access to their sons, and I was not going to lose access to my only child because of a feeling I couldn't yet prove. They married in 2018. Vanessa moved into the Craven Street house, and the questions started. Month 3. Pearl, do you know how much this house is worth? In this market? A friend of mine in real estate said properties like this are going for $700,000-800,000. Month 6. Have you ever thought about updating the deed, just to make sure everything's clear? Year 1. Jerome and I met with a financial planner. He thinks we should consider the house's role in our long-term wealth strategy. The financial planner was a real estate developer named Marcus Webb, who wanted to buy historic Black-owned properties in Beaufort's gentrifying corridor. I knew Marcus. I'd seen him across a mediation table in 2014 when he tried to pressure purchase a heir's property on Bay Street from an elderly woman who didn't understand what she was signing. The mediator on that case was me. Marcus lost, and now his name was coming out of my daughter-in-law's mouth, attached to the word strategy. I declined every suggestion with the same warm smile. The house is handled, Vanessa. Don't you worry about it. Vanessa worried about it. She worried about it the way developers worry about properties they can't access. Constantly, strategically, with the patience of someone who believes time is on their side because the old woman will die eventually, and the property will come loose, and the reaching will finally connect. She didn't know about the trust. Jerome didn't tell her because I asked him not to. We had one conversation about it in 2017, before the marriage. I sat him down at the kitchen table and explained the trust and the update I'd made in 2015. In 2015, after Clarence's death and before Jerome's marriage, I'd updated the trust with Howard Gibbs, my estate attorney. I added a reversion clause. If Jerome dies without Fontaine bloodline children, the house goes to the Beaufort Heritage Foundation, a local nonprofit that preserves historic Black-owned properties in the Lowcountry. I retain a life estate, meaning I live in the house for the rest of my life regardless of what happens, and only after my death does the foundation take full ownership. I also added an explicit spousal exclusion clause. The house was legally untouchable, even if Jerome died. Even if I was the last Fontaine standing. The house was mine until I left this world, and then it would belong to an organization that protects houses like it from people like Vanessa. Jerome, the house is protected, I told him at the kitchen table. If anything happens to either of us, the house stays in Fontaine hands or goes to the Heritage Foundation. Spouses are excluded, not because I don't want you to share your life, because I've spent 30 years watching people share property with spouses and lose both the property and the spouse. Jerome understood. He signed the updated trust document as the beneficiary. And then I said something to him that I'd been thinking since I first saw Vanessa's eyes move across the living room walls. If she loves you, the trust won't matter. If she loves the house, the trust is why we need it. Jerome nodded. He didn't argue. Because somewhere beneath his trust in Vanessa, beneath the love and the optimism and the belief that people are good, my son heard the wrong note. The same wrong note I'd been hearing. He just didn't want to name it. So he let me name it for him. And he kept it quiet. My daughter-in-law committed federal mortgage fraud on a house she didn't own by forging my son's signature on a loan application and stealing $127,000 from a bank. I found out 2 years before my son died. I held the evidence. I filed it. I waited. Because I'm a retired family court mediator who spent 30 years learning that the most powerful thing about information isn't having it. It's knowing when to use it. If you've ever held a truth in your pocket while the person it belonged to sat across from you at Sunday dinner smiling, tell me about the wait. because I carried it for 2 years, and the weight was exactly the weight of my son's happiness, which is the heaviest thing a mother ever holds, the HELOC. This is where Vanessa crossed from ambition to crime. 2021, 3 years into the marriage. Without Jerome's knowledge, without the trust's authorization, without any legal right to the property, Vanessa went to a bank in Charleston, not Beaufort, where she'd be recognized, and applied for a home equity line of credit on 14 Craven Street. She listed herself as co-owner. She forged Jerome's signature on the application. She submitted falsified property documents showing joint ownership of a house that was held in an irrevocable trust that excluded her by name and by law, and by the specific foresight of a school janitor in 1978 who understood that paper is the only fortress that survives when everything else falls. The bank approved $127,000. Vanessa drew the full amount over 8 months and used it to fund 2 real estate flips in Dorchester County. Both flips failed. The money evaporated. The HELOC payments were being made from a credit card pyramid that was going to collapse eventually, the way all pyramids collapse from the bottom up, taking everything stacked on top with it. I found out in 2022. Howard Gibbs, my estate attorney, discovered the HELOC lien during a routine trust review, a lien on a property that legally cannot be liened, a mortgage on a house that legally cannot be mortgaged, a signature that legally couldn't have been signed by the person whose name it bore because the person whose name it bore didn't own what the signature claimed he owned. Howard brought me the evidence. The HELOC application, the forged signature, the falsified ownership documents, the bank records showing the $127,000 draw. He also brought a forensic handwriting analysis from an expert named Dr. Letitia Osborne, who compared Jerome's known handwriting to the signature on the application and concluded, the question signature exhibits fundamental differences in baseline, letter formation, and pen pressure that are inconsistent with the known exemplars of Jerome Fontaine. Howard looked at me across his desk. This is mortgage fraud, Pearl, federal crime, forgery, identity theft, bank fraud on a federally insured loan. What do you want to do? I looked at the folder. I thought about Jerome. I thought about the way he looked at Vanessa across the dinner table with the expression of a man who believes he's lucky. And the distance between lucky and deceived is measured not in facts, but in which direction you're looking when the truth is behind you. Hold it, I said. File it. Lock it. I'll tell you when. When what? When she overplays her hand, because she will. People who steal always overplay. They always reach one more time. And when she reaches, I'll be ready. Howard locked the folder in his safe. I went home. I made dinner. Vanessa came to Sunday supper and complimented my collard greens, and I said, "Thank you, baby," with the same warm smile I've always given her, and the folder sat in Howard's safe like a loaded weapon behind glass, waiting for the emergency that would justify breaking it. The emergency arrived in a church parking lot in September 2024, when Vanessa told me to leave my own house 30 days after burying my son. Jerome's death. I need to tell you about it because the way he died matters. Not medically, emotionally. September 2024. Brain aneurysm. During football practice at Beaufort High. He was running a drill with his players, the same drill he'd run 1,000 times, and he stopped mid-sentence. He put his hand on his head. He looked at his assistant coach, a man named Deshaun who'd been with him for 8 years, and said, "Something's wrong, D." And then he was on the ground and the players were screaming and the paramedics were 7 minutes away, and 7 minutes was too many for a brain that was bleeding in a way that brains can't survive. He was pronounced dead at Beaufort Memorial Hospital at 4:47 p.m. He was 42 years old. I received the call at 4:52 p.m. I was in my kitchen, making tea. The phone rang and the voice on the other end was the school principal, and the principal was crying, and principals don't cry when they call parents, unless the child they're calling about has stopped being alive, and the tea is getting cold, and the kitchen is the same kitchen where Jerome was born, and the distance between birth and death in that kitchen is 42 years, and a phone call and a cup of tea that will never be finished. The funeral. 3 days later, St. Helena's Episcopal Church, 350 people. I sat in the front pew in a black dress and a hat my mother Odessa had worn to Lucien's funeral. Because Fontaine women wear the same hat to funerals the way soldiers wear the same uniform to war. As armor, as tradition, as proof that you've survived this before, and you'll survive it again even when the surviving feels impossible. Because the person in the casket is your only child, and the casket is made of wood, and the wood is holding the only thing you ever made that mattered. Vanessa sat beside me. She cried during the service. I watched her cry and assessed the tears the way a mediator assesses testimony, not for authenticity, but for function. Were the tears grief or performance? I concluded, both. Vanessa had lived with Jerome for 6 years. Some of the love was real, but the tears were also positioned, visible, audible. The tears of a woman establishing herself as the primary mourner, because primary mourners have primary claims, and the claim she was building was for the house. After the service, the parking lot. You know what happened next? She said 30 days. I said, okay. I smiled. I left. I drove home. I walked through the house. I touched the walls. I stood in the kitchen. I stood on the porch. I packed one bag. I called Opal. I need your guest room tonight. What happened? Vanessa told me to leave the house. Opal's pause was 3 seconds. She did not. She did. At the funeral, in the parking lot, while I was holding Jerome's program. Pearl Fontaine, please tell me you have a plan. Opal, I've had a plan since 2015, and a folder since 2022. I just needed her to say the words. What words? The wrong ones. I stayed at Opal's that night. Opal Gadsden, my best friend, 69 years old, retired school teacher. She's known the Fontaine family for 50 years. She was at my wedding. She was at Clarence's funeral. She was at Jerome's funeral. She's been at every Fontaine milestone because Opal Gadsden is the kind of friend who shows up at every door, in every weather, without being asked, because showing up is what friends do, and asking is what strangers do, and Opal has never been a stranger. Midnight. She knocked on the guest room door. She was holding 2 glasses of bourbon. She sat on the bed beside me. You just buried your son, and you're protecting his house, and you haven't cried yet, Pearl. You can cry now. Nobody's keeping score. Not yet. When? After 9:30 tomorrow morning. What happens at 9:30? Vanessa gets a visitor. Opal looked at me. The look of a woman who has known you for 50 years and recognizes the specific expression on your face that means the chess game is over, and you're about to turn the board around, and the other player doesn't know it yet. Lord Pearl, what did you do? I prepared. 8:15 a.m. Tuesday morning, the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office. I walked in wearing a blue dress and carrying the folder that had been sitting in Howard Gibbs's safe for 2 years. I asked to speak with a detective who handles financial crimes. I was directed to Detective Nia Crawford, 44, sharp, the kind of woman who reads documents the way I read people, looking for the lie between the lines. I sat down. I opened the folder. I laid out the contents the way I've laid out. Evidence in 1,000 mediations. Organized, chronological, precise. Each document labeled, each connection annotated. Not because Detective Crawford needed the hand-holding, but because presentation is respect, and respect is how a retired mediator demonstrates that she's not emotional, she's evidential. The HELOC application, Vanessa's name, the Craven Street address, Jerome's forged signature, the property documents, falsified to show joint ownership, the actual trust documents showing the house has been in the Fontaine Family Irrevocable Trust since 1978, Dr. Letitia Osborne's forensic handwriting analysis. Expert conclusion, the signature is not Jerome's. The bank records, $127,000 drawn over 8 months, deposited into Vanessa's personal accounts, used to fund failed real estate purchases in Dorchester County. Crawford reviewed everything. She looked at me. How long have you had this? 2 years. Why didn't you report it then? Because my son was alive, and reporting his wife for federal fraud would have destroyed him. He loved her, or he loved who he thought she was. Either way, the love was real to him, and detonating it with a fraud indictment would have been a cruelty worse than the crime. So I held it. I protected him by carrying the weight of what his wife was doing and saying nothing. What changed? My son died on a football field 3 days ago, And yesterday, his wife stood in a church parking lot and told me to leave the house she committed a federal crime against. The person I was protecting is gone. The reason I was silent is buried. And the woman who thinks she just inherited my family's house is about to discover that the house was never her husband's to give, never hers to take, and the $127,000 she stole from a bank using my son's forged signature is a federal crime that carries up to 30 years. Crawford picked up her phone. By 9:30 a.m., 2 deputies were at 14 Craven Street. Vanessa answered the door in the silk robe she bought with money from the HELOC in a house she didn't own, on a porch that Augustus Fontaine built in 1920 with hands that knew the difference between building and taking, and the deputies informed her that she was under investigation for mortgage fraud, forgery, identity theft, and bank fraud. Meanwhile, Howard Gibbs filed a legal notice, a formal declaration that the Craven Street house is held in the Fontaine Family Irrevocable Trust, that Jerome was a beneficiary but never an owner, that Pearl retains a life estate, granting her the right to live in the house for her lifetime, that Vanessa has no legal claim to the property, and that she has 30 days to vacate. The same 30 days she gave me. I didn't choose that number for poetry. I chose it because symmetry is its own kind of justice. Vanessa received both notifications on the same day, the trust notice from Howard, the criminal investigation notice from Detective Crawford, 2 pieces of paper that dismantled everything she'd been building since 2018, the claim to the house, the assumption of inheritance, the 6-year strategy of marrying into property and waiting for it to fall into her hands. She called me that evening. I answered, because some conversations need to happen, and some of those conversations need to happen with the mother-in-law. Pearl, this is a mistake. I didn't forge anything. The bank must have... The handwriting expert says otherwise, Vanessa, and the trust documents say the house was never yours to borrow against. You took $127,000 from a bank using Jerome's name on a property you never owned. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. And I've known about it for 2 years. 2 years? You knew for 2 years, and you didn't... I didn't say anything because Jerome was alive, and I loved my son more than I hated what you were doing. Confronting you would have broken him, so I carried it. Every Sunday dinner, every holiday, every time you sat in my kitchen and ate food I cooked and smiled at my son across the table, I was carrying the folder that would end your marriage and your freedom, and I chose to keep carrying it because my son's happiness was worth more than your punishment. Silence. The specific silence of a person who has just heard something they cannot argue with because the argument was sacrificed for love, and love, even misdirected, even painful, even carrying a folder of federal evidence, is unanswerable. But Jerome is gone, I said, and the protection I was giving, you for his sake died with him. You had my silence as long as I had my son. Now I have neither, and you have 30 days. I held evidence of federal fraud for 2 years to protect my son from the truth about his wife. I let the woman who was stealing from his house eat Sunday dinner at his table because confronting her would have broken him, and I would rather carry the weight of her crime in silence for the rest of my life than watch my son's heart break under a truth he wasn't ready for. Mothers do this. We carry the things that would destroy our children, and we smile, and we serve dinner, and we file the evidence in a safe deposit box, and we wait. Not because we're weak, because we're strategic. And the strategy is love. If you've ever carried a truth that could destroy someone you love and held it because the holding was less painful than the telling, tell me about the wait. Because I know the wait. I carried it for 730 days, and I'd carry it again. Vanessa hired a lawyer, Craig Delancey, expensive, aggressive, the kind of lawyer who bills $400 an hour and earns it by making opposing counsel uncomfortable. He reviewed the trust documents and the criminal evidence and told Vanessa something she'd never heard from anyone in 6 years of marriage to my son. You have no claim to the house. 0. The Fontaine Family Irrevocable Trust was established in 1978. It was updated in 2015 with a spousal exclusion clause and a life estate provision for Pearl. Jerome was a beneficiary, not an owner. He couldn't sell it, mortgage it, or transfer it. When he died, Pearl's life estate continues. She lives there for the rest of her life. After her death, the house goes to the Beaufort Heritage Foundation. You are not in the trust. You are not a beneficiary. You are not an heir. You are a guest who overstayed. Can we challenge it? On what grounds? The trust predates your marriage by 40 years. It was established by Pearl's father, updated by Pearl, consented to by Jerome. It's valid, it's ironclad, and challenging it would cost you $200,000 in legal fees and end in the same place. You losing. The only thing worse than losing is losing slowly and expensively. The federal case was faster. The FBI accepted the referral from Beaufort County. The evidence was comprehensive. The forged signature, the falsified documents, the bank records, the forensic handwriting analysis. Vanessa was indicted in November 2024, charged with mortgage fraud, forgery, identity theft, and bank fraud on a federally insured loan. The trial was in February 2025, Charleston Federal Courthouse. Vanessa's defense: I believed I had ownership rights as Jerome's wife. The loan application reflected my understanding of our marital property. The federal prosecutor, AUSA Tanya Brevard, responded, Understanding doesn't authorize forgery. The documents Ms. Caldwell submitted to the bank didn't reflect a misunderstanding. They reflected fabrication. She created false ownership documents. She forged her husband's signature. She deceived a federally insured institution into releasing $127,000 on a property she had no legal right to encumber. This isn't a domestic misunderstanding. It's a federal crime. Howard Gibbs testified about the trust. Dr. Letitia Osborne testified about the handwriting. The bank's loan officer testified that the application was approved based on documents that were, in his words, professionally prepared and convincing, which is a polite way of saying Vanessa was good at fraud. She just wasn't good enough to escape a retired family court mediator who'd spent 30 years learning to read the space between what people say and what they do. Verdict: guilty on all counts. Sentence: 30 months federal prison, full restitution of $127,000 to the bank, and a personal irony that I noted without comment to anyone except Opal over bourbon on the porch of Craven Street the evening after the sentencing. Vanessa gave me 30 days to leave. The court gave Vanessa 30 months to sit. Sometimes the math works out. 6 months later, April 2025. I'm back in the house on Craven Street. I never really left. One night at Opal's. That's all it took. The house waited for me, the way houses wait for the people who belong in them, patiently, with the porch light on and the foundation holding and the live oaks standing guard the way they've stood guard since before Augustus laid the tabby and before Lucian wrote the trust and before Pearl filed the folder and before Vanessa Caldwell learned that the difference between reaching and having is a legal document written by a school janitor in 1978 who understood that paper is the only fortress that survives when everything else falls. I've made changes, not to the house. The house is the same: tabby, tin, porch. The creak in the third step that Clarence said he'd fix and never did, because some things you don't fix. You just step around them and call them character. The changes are in what I'm doing with the time the house gives me. I volunteer at the Beaufort Heritage Foundation, helping other families protect their historic properties through trusts and legal structures. I sit with elderly black homeowners in Beaufort County and explain what Lucian explained to me, that the house isn't just a house, it's a document. It's proof your people were here, and proof needs protection because the people who want to take it don't announce themselves. They marry into it, they smile at Sunday dinner, they wait for the funeral, and then they tell you to leave. I established a scholarship at Beaufort High in Jerome's name, the Jerome Fontaine Memorial Scholarship for first-generation college students, funded from the Trust's discretionary account. The first recipient is a girl named Imani from Jerome's AP History class, who wants to study education at USC Beaufort, because Jerome told her she could, and she believed him, because Jerome Fontaine had the specific authority of a teacher who believes in his students louder than the world disbelieves in them. Opal visits every Sunday. We sit on the porch and drink sweet tea and play dominoes and argue about whether the azaleas need pruning. I say yes. She says, let them grow wild. The argument has been running for 30 years. It'll run for 30 more. I visit Jerome's grave every Wednesday. Not Sunday. Sunday is for the living. Wednesday is for the missing. I bring flowers. I talk to him. I tell him about the house, about the scholarship, about Imani, about the azaleas. I don't tell him about Vanessa, not because I'm still protecting him, because some conversations with the dead should be about what's growing, not what's been cut down. And everything growing at 14, Craven Street started with seeds that Jerome planted. In his students, in his community, in the house he loved, and the trust he signed, and the mother he trusted to protect both. Sunday evening, the porch on Craven Street. I'm in the rocking chair that Clarence bought at a yard sale in 1987 for $6, and that I've been sitting in for 37 years because some furniture outlasts the people who bought it, and the outlasting is its own kind of loyalty. The chair creaks. The live oaks hold the Spanish moss. The light does what Beaufort light does at dusk, turns everything gold, including the tabby walls and the tin roof and the woman in the rocking chair, who has been sitting on this porch since before Vanessa Caldwell was born and will be sitting on this porch long after Vanessa Caldwell is released from a federal facility in West Virginia and discovers that the world doesn't return what you've taken just because you've served your time. Augustus, I say to the house, to the walls, to the foundation that a black man laid in 1920 with shells from the same ocean that fed Clarence and money saved by hands that had been told they couldn't own anything and owned it anyway. I kept it. They tried to take it. A woman married my son and forged his name and stole from a bank and told me to leave, and I smiled and packed one bag, and the next morning the police were at her door and the house is still here and I'm still here, and your name is still on the trust, and the porch still creaks and the azaleas still need pruning, and the tea is still sweet and the light still turns everything gold at dusk. The chair rocks, the porch creaks, the house holds, the way it's held for 104 years, through everything, through everyone. Through the specific, relentless, beautiful stubbornness of a family that was told they couldn't own anything and built a house and a trust and a legacy that outlived every person who tried to take it. 100 years, 5 generations, one house, one trust, one retired family court mediator who spent 30 years learning that the strongest thing a woman can do isn't fight, it's prepare, and then smile, and then wait, and when the person who underestimated you says the wrong thing in a parking lot at your son's funeral, you say, okay, and you pack one bag and you walk out the front door knowing that every step you take away from that house is a step toward the moment the house comes back to you. Because it was always yours, and it was always going to be yours. And the only person who didn't know that was the person who thought 30 days was enough to erase 100 years. It wasn't. It never is. What's the oldest thing your family owns? Not the most expensive, the oldest. The thing that's been in your family longer than anyone alive can remember acquiring it. The house, the land, the ring, the recipe, the chair that creaks on the third step. Tell me about it. Because the oldest things in a family aren't just objects, they're proof. Proof that your people were here, that they built something, that they survived, and the people who try to take those things aren't just stealing property. They're stealing proof of your existence, protected, with a trust, with a lawyer, with the specific, quiet, devastating preparation of a woman who smiles when she's already won. Because the people who come for your family's house don't announce themselves with a legal notice. They announce themselves with a wedding invitation, and the time to prepare isn't after the funeral, it's before the engagement. Get the trust, file the paper, protect the proof. The azaleas still need pruning, the tea is still sweet, the porch still creaks. And Vanessa Caldwell has a new address. It's federal. I'll see you in the next one.